They called me the stinky country girl while I was standing in the middle of my own ballroom. It wasn't loud, just the kind of little hiss you hear when someone thinks a whisper is clever and the room will never notice. But the words landed, soft and precise, the way a pebble skips twice and then sinks. Sloane, radiant, practiced, the center of a blue and ivory staged dream, leaned toward a bridesmaid and let the insult fall like confetti nobody picked up. The stinky country girl is here. I felt it the way you feel a draft in a house you built, a small betrayal that skims the skin but talks to the blood. I could see the flash of it on the faces around me, the polite smile stiffening, the way my mother's hand tightened around her champagne glass. Garrett, my brother, laughed at something off-key the band played and missed it entirely. There are two ways to respond when people assume you're less than you are. One is to roar, the other is to rearrange the furniture. I never pretended to be anything but deliberate. 3 years ago, I had signed the deed on this building. For 4 years before that, while I learned the business from the ground up and paid off the first mortgage with blistered hands and late nights, I had pulled the family out of tight spots without telling them it was me. I had set the payments, covered the utilities, wired money for medical bills and for Dad's truck after it got totaled. They believed Garrett was the benefactor. He liked the idea. He had always liked praise. It's easier to accept a kind of heroism you'd been given than one that complicates who you are. So when Sloane's whispered barb slipped into the crowd, it landed on the wrong person. I inhaled the scent of the monarch, leather and citrus, a trace of the old floral arrangement, and watched Sloane's hand drift to her throat when the necklace caught the light. My grandmother's necklace. A simple strand, small and familiar like a hinge in a room that knows what it supports. For years I had worn it in private, letting the weight of my grandmother's initials settle against my collarbone when business decisions felt like walking a tightrope. Weeks earlier I had seen it pinned to the bride-to-be, as if it had always belonged there. That, more than the whisper, made me turn my head. If you have to be insulted in public, the theater of it is almost always less sharp than the assumption that made the insult possible. A night like this isn't about the couple, it's about the balance of who is seen and who is invisible. Tonight the balance felt wrong. My outward reaction was minimal. I raised my glass and smiled because the room was watching, and because Garrett's smile needed no jolt from me. But inside, answers were assembling like a blueprint. I wanted to know 2 things: why Sloane thought that slur meant anything, and how my grandmother's necklace had migrated from our family to her neck. I found the hallway that hugs the ballroom the way a secret hugs a house. Narrow, with the good lighting, and no music. The band sounded muffled. The party sounded distant. A man's voice carried down the corridor, a voice I didn't expect to hear in my hotel's reception. Franklin Whitmore, smooth as lacquer, speaking with the practiced urgency of a man who thinks problems are a matter of presentation. He didn't know I was 5 steps away, leaning against the crown molding like it was going to tell me the truth. "We need this one," he said into his phone, low but sharp. "They've got money. The Burns aren't stupid, they just don't flash it. That's even better." He said it as if he were describing a property he planned to flip. Later, when I replayed that fragment in my head, every syllable struck with the certainty of proof. They had targeted us because of a misconception, that we were a family of easy marks with a secret fortune someone else could steer into their hands. It wasn't malice at first, it was calculation. The insult at the table was a prop to define me as someone disposable. Garrett's fiancée had a last name that could be polished into anything. Whitmore sounded like a landed family in a book. Their parents looked like an upper continental portrait, and smiled in the same way men who have spent decades on the social circuit smile, serenely, with a pocket full of practice. But the name on a napkin can't prove what the pockets conceal. I needed evidence. I walked back into the ballroom as if I'd been in the restroom the entire time, relaxed and mannered, and found Wesley at the bar. He had been my general manager for 3 years and knew how I liked my problems, boxed and labeled. Wesley is a tall man with a surgical sense of calm. He greeted me with a half smile that said he had already noticed something and didn't want to alarm me. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "But I overheard something. I want you to check the Whitmores, discreetly." I kept my voice casual because the last thing I wanted was for the Whitmores to sense a threat and dissolve into defense. If they were planning anything, panicking them could make a mess of the evidence. Besides, Wesley liked a clean plan. He nodded and said, "I'll have Javier look at their tabs and security footage. If anything's off, I'll ping you." That phrase, "I'll ping you," is the modern lullaby of management, and I let myself believe it would be enough for the moment, but I traded the temporary silence for a longer strategy that night. A whisper was a spark. I intended to follow the smoke. "I'm going to tell you something that sounds like a private indulgence, and is, in reality, a business lesson.
Rising from cleaning rooms at 20 to owning a boutique hotel chain at 31 was less about luck and more about being painfully good at small things. You learn to notice stains that other people ignore. You see how the light hits a table to make a room feel expensive.
You learn the habit of staying 10 minutes longer after everyone leaves and fixing the hinge that, if it breaks, will cost you twice as much. It's monotonous work, and monotony teaches you the geometry of power. When I was 18, I left Millbrook with 2 suitcases and a stubborn idea: work in the industry until I could make better choices than the ones being made for me. I slept in shift rooms, polished rooms after midnight, learned accounting off forums, and from every finance manager who had patience to explain what room rates could and couldn't do. By 28, I signed my first property, a small place that used to be a funeral home and smelled faintly of lilies. By 30, I had 3 properties. Birch Hospitality had weathered 1 loan and 2 recession scares. We did not grow with parades and champagne toasts. We grew with spreadsheets, with contractors who respected us because we paid, on time, and with the kind of attention to detail that turns guests into repeat customers. That history matters because people like the Whitmores read narratives and then write themselves into them. They had assumed our family's modest past meant someone else, Garrett, or an imagined wealthy uncle, was the hidden benefactor. Someone who wore suits and hosted people at clubs would be easier to marry into in their minds. So Sloane, who at this point I'd started thinking of as Sandra in my head, played the role she thought she needed to play: soft, polished, slightly scornful at small-town origins. Later, when I stood in the back of the ballroom and watched the guests orbit the couple like planets, I thought of all the nights I'd scrubbed baseboards until my fingers bled, and then signed off on a repair invoice that kept the place safe for guests. Those invoices and those nights were a ledger, and it was that ledger I intended to use. Wesley's initial check turned up the usual party details: caterer, florist, rented tuxes. Nothing illegal screamed off the pages. But he's a good man. He looked at me after the 3rd pass and said, "These people have portfolios. I can ghost them outside, track where they sit when they come to the lobby. If they use our valet, we get a name. If they sign guest names, we can see if any of them match another city." That is how investigations begin in a hotel, with names on keys and patterns on reservation sheets. Wesley found a small discrepancy: an invoice for consulting that was routed through a company name, Whitmore Properties LLC, which didn't match the Whitmore house in town or any public records. It looked tidy, it looked deliberate. I spent most of the evening playing a role I was trained for: hostess, owner, the woman people are supposed to feel comfortable around. The truth was I couldn't sit on the discovery. I've always thought of the world in 2 registers: what needs to be fixed right now and what needs to be fixed forever. An insult at a wedding is a one-night event. A targeted marital con, where your family is the prize, is a pattern you don't want to let evolve. At 3 in the morning, after the guests had thinned and the final singer had packed his microphone, I sat at my desk with a glass of flat champagne and started making calls. My lawyer is Rebecca Thornton. If you have a lawyer you trust, you know the voice on the phone that says, "Tell me everything," and then keeps listening until you stop apologizing for what you know. Rebecca did not flinch at the word Whitmore. She asked about documentation and timelines. She suggested, offhand, that we get a forensic accountant involved. I said yes before she finished the sentence. Naomi Delaney was a name Rebecca gave me, quiet and efficient on paper, with a reputation for finding money where other people saw only ledgers. Forensic accounting is less glamorous than it sounds. It's a fluorescent-lit examination of mismatched totals and suspect transfers, the tedious detective work of the financial world. Naomi's first email came with a line that read, "If there's a pattern, I'll find it." That is the kind of confidence that does not need to be loud. Over the next week, because I insisted on speed but Rebecca insisted on thoroughness, we assembled a modest but solid team. Wesley handled the operations side. He reviewed the reservation logs, flagged names that repeated across different events, and pulled security footage where it might show a Whitmore signature on a guest book. Rebecca handled the legal avenues: subpoenas, a winding web of requests to third-party payment processors, and the slow kindness of follow-through. Naomi, when I gave her access to the financial files I could lawfully obtain for the Monarch, and to the irregular invoices Wesley had flagged, began to produce a map and spreadsheets in red ink. The map was ugly in its elegance. Naomi called it a pre-pattern. To a lay person, that meant we weren't looking at one sloppy theft. We were looking at the shape of an enterprise. She found old aliases, small shell companies in neighboring states, a series of wire transfers that were routed through different accounts, as if someone were playing a game of financial hopscotch. The Whitmore Properties LLC invoice that had looked tidy at first had tentacles stretching into trusts and trusts into personal accounts that weren't registered to Franklin or Delilah Whitmore at all.
Two things happened that week that turned my annoyance into a plan. First, Naomi traced a name we had seen on an old filing to a record in Arizona under the alias Sandra Williams, with a framed fraud case, dated, small, a few years behind, but public. The name matched Sloane's maiden. If Sloane was an alias cooked up for glamour, Naomi had found the real ingredient. Second, Rebecca told me she had a contact at the federal level who had handled similar cases and would be willing to look at a probable cause packet if she assembled the documents. That contact was Agent Carla Reeves.
When you decide to pull the professional levers that lead to arrest and exposure, you learn the art of timing. Law enforcement doesn't walk into a ballroom because one woman says someone is suspicious. You present them with a line of facts long enough to stand up. You do not, under any circumstances, set a spectacle. You let evidence do the work. While Naomi dug through bank ledgers and cross-referenced addresses, I collected the personal details that made the plan human. My grandmother's necklace had a story. It wasn't jewelry in the sense that it was valuable because of lineage. My grandmother had once told me that necklaces are like promises. You feel them touch you, and you remember why you are who you are. When Patricia, my mother, had brought photos to a family dinner and said with a kind of absent pride, "I gave it to Garrett's fiancée, it suits her," that sentence lodged in me like a splinter. Patricia hadn't meant harm. She had been flattered and exhausted, persuaded that the gesture would solidify a bond the family desperately wanted. I understood that impulse and resented it in the same measured breath. I had been paying our bills for 4 years in secret, so my mother could keep a life that felt stable. She gave away the necklace without knowing whom she was giving it to. That mattered. There is also a cost to anonymity. Doing good behind the curtain denies you the chance to correct people's false narratives, like the one that credits Garrett for every check that landed in our mailbox. I had kept the payments anonymous partly to avoid the awkwardness of charity at a discount, partly to let my mother keep the illusion, partly because it was easier to be the unseen hand. But anonymity also meant the family, and everyone overhearing Sloane's whisper, assigned power where it wasn't. They imagined a story in which we were naive, gullible, easily bought. That false narrative made them comfortable with their scorn. So I decided, quietly, to change the story. We moved slowly. Naomi produced a dossier that read like a biography of bad intentions, shell companies in 3 states, matching deposit patterns that suggested a Ponzi-style approach securing funds by promise rather than revenue. She flagged loans that had been secured under names that matched neither Franklin nor Delilah's public records. In short, they had infrastructure. Rebecca drafted letters and requests for records that would make an investigator's job easier, aligning dates and account numbers like stepping stones. Wesley found the small things that tied the Whitmores to a pattern of living that outpaced their declared assets. New suitcases, lease payments made in cash, events paid for at high-end venues but routed through lesser-known vendors. It wasn't slumming. It was someone wearing a costume and expecting the room to buy it. The more we found, the more I felt the old itch, less for revenge than for correction. It's one thing for people to be wrong about you. It's another for their falseness to be a weapon they use to hurt those who trust them. The necklace, the whisper, the donor misconception, they all folded into one problem. People were suffering from an error that could be corrected with documents and testimony. When Rebecca said she could reach Agent Reeves if I authorized her to prepare a packet, I signed the release. You don't get to invite federal agents into a private party unless you are ready for the ripple. Rebecca moved with professional calm. She told me exactly what she would ask for and what she couldn't do. She told me what would happen if the evidence didn't meet the threshold. That clarity was a comfort. It meant I wasn't acting out of spite. I was acting by procedure. There is a misconception about people who are quietly successful, that we want to shine. Most of us don't. We want rooms that function, staff that are safe, and families that aren't exploited. The point of exposure, for me, wasn't the spectacle. It was the restoration. You can see that most clearly in the necklace. I didn't want to snatch it as proof of victory. I wanted to get it back to my mother with an explanation that would remove the shame she felt about being wronged. As the week unfolded, I kept the party face on. I hosted a brunch at the Monarch for the post-wedding crowd, made small talk about linens and band choices, and let the Whitmores bask in the warmth of people who like events. At night, Rebecca and Naomi would send me bullet points and preliminary reports. Naomi's notes were the only thing that set my teeth on edge, in a useful way. She would send a list of wire transfers, a column of dates and amounts, and then a short line. This is the part where your family becomes a target if no one stops it. Rebecca made the call. She prepared a summary and contacted Agent Carla Reeves with an outline of suspicious activity and a heads up that we had some evidence that could be assembled into probable cause. Agent Reeves replied with professional reserve. She wouldn't promise arrests on a whim, but she would look at a packet. The difference between a promise and an investigation is paper, and Rebecca was excellent with it. I remember thinking at one point that if you replace drama with documentation, the world becomes less scary.
There was one logistical fact I had to reconcile: how to make sure the people who had been scornful in my presence felt the consequences of being wrong, without turning the night into a public lynching. I'd seen that happen, revenge masquerading as virtue, and I wasn't interested. I wanted justice that resembled surgery: precise, necessary, healing. So we began to plan an exposure that would be surgical.
It would be public, not for the publicity, but because the safest place for the Whitmores to meet their end was under the light, where their actions had been performed. Their reach had included local bank branches, wedding venues, and charitable solicitations. Exposing them in the room where they had laughed at us felt right in a way that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with truth. Wesley had access to our AV. Our ballrooms have screens in the corners, useful for slideshow montages and the occasional skyline time-lapse. They also have the capability to show documents clearly to a room of people in 4K. Naomi's forensic files included clear snapshots of filings, signatures, and transfer logs. Rebecca's packet could provide the narrative. Agent Reeves wanted to see the assembled evidence. She suggested we not do anything hasty. She needed probable cause, not a dramatic evening. I agreed that law must lead. But there's a difference between legal restraint and moral timidity. The Whitmores had been building a story about us for months. If we gave them the luxury of time, they might marry, launder, or disappear. The clock mattered because they were not merely taking assets. They were taking the trust of our family. And trust is the kind of currency that, once debased, is hard to exchange for anything else. So we set a plan that had two parts: procedural and theatrical, in the technical sense. Procedural meant that Rebecca would assemble the packet and present it to Agent Reeves in a timeline that preserved chain of custody and allowed federal involvement. Theatrical, only insofar as it required timing, meant that we would have a moment where the facts were visible and undeniable to everyone in one place, and Agent Reeves would be present to act if the evidence met the threshold. I am not a person who enjoys police sirens. I like quiet efficacy. Still, the idea of the Whitmores discovering their spreadsheeted truth while surrounded by people they had mocked felt in a small way like a reclamation of dignity for those who had been embarrassed or exploited. For Patricia, who had given away a piece of family and didn't see how fragile her judgment could be, it would be a chance to understand. We rehearsed scenarios. Rebecca cautioned against grandstanding. Naomi insisted on precise documentation: timestamps, corroborating receipts, cross-check deposits. Wesley plotted logistics: ensure there were cameras on the screens, a way to swap inputs without drawing attention, staff ready to take guests where they needed to go once the moment happened. I watched their faces and they all believed the same thing. Evidence, presented calmly, is devastating. One evening, in my office overlooking the monarch's courtyard, Naomi slid a printed sheet across the desk. It had one column filled with dates and account numbers that matched the invoices Wesley had found. She pointed at a row where a wire transfer had been routed through a trust in a neighboring state, and then split into payments that covered an extravagant rehearsal dinner and an investment opportunity. She tapped the number as if she could stitch it into a wound. "This is the node," she said. "This is where they lie." Rebecca folded her hands on top of the papers and looked at me. "If you authorize me, I'll present this directly to Agent Reeves. I'll ask for a warrant for the accounts. If she gets it, we can coordinate timing." "And if she doesn't?" I asked. I had to ask because it's the honest accountant's question. Rebecca's answer was practical. "If the threshold isn't there, we continue to collect. But you should be prepared for that. Timing should align with the evidence." I made the decision that night with the same flat resolve I used to sign a building mortgage. There was a cost to doing nothing and a cost to moving too fast. We would assemble the files and present them. If the law moved, we would not be the mob. If the law didn't, we would keep building the case until it did. One small human thing kept me awake more than the spreadsheets: Garrett. He was without question my brother, my family in the way blood dictates, and I had never wanted this to be a public humiliation for him. He had believed in Sloane the way you sometimes believe in an image you want to be true, and when the truth is revealed it will hurt him. That possibility made me keep my hand softer than I wanted. If there was any way to expose the Whitmores while still protecting Garrett from the sting of being betrayed, I wanted it. That meant timing the reveal in a way that minimized Garrett's public embarrassment. It didn't mean hiding the truth from him. It meant giving him space to choose which side of the ledger he would take when the facts appeared. I owed him that. We had been children who traded comic books and secrets. Adulthood had layered us with different fears, but our shared history remained. In the week leading up to what we called the event in our internal chatter, I found myself thinking of the necklace with increasing frequency. Patricia had been flattered and distracted, and she had handed it over with no ill intent. I wanted it back with explanations and apologies, not as spoil from a battle. It would have been easy. If the Whitmores were simply thieves, I could have taken my grandmother's chain back by force or by a confrontational scene. I didn't want easy. Easy would have been me behaving in a way that made me indistinguishable from the people I hoped to expose.
So the plan favored law, not spectacle. Rebecca would put the packet together. Naomi would certify the findings and provide the printouts. Wesley would ready the AV so that the documents could be displayed cleanly on every screen. Rebecca would contact Agent Reeves to arrange for her presence, on the understanding that if the evidence met probable cause, she would act quickly.
I would stand in the room and be quiet, a presence rather than a performance. We rehearsed subtler things, how to switch the AV input without drawing attention, how to ensure that the hotel staff could close off exits politely if needed, where the band might be asked to pause without upsetting the wedding vibe. None of it required me to break the law. It required professional preparation and restraint. The night before, I walked through the Monarch with a flashlight, like a person checking a ship before the voyage. The chandeliers hum like borrowed constellations. The ballroom smelled of polished wood and lemon. I could see the trace of the wedding's theme in the leftover place cards. I ran my fingers along the back of a chair and thought about small things, hinges, invoices, signatures, and how each small thing is a place where a story can be corrected. My mother called me that night. There's a soft, particular tone she uses when she's trying to arrange her feelings into sentences I can tolerate. "Bethany, are you sure about all this?" she asked. I was. "I'm doing the right thing, Ma, for the family." I didn't say, "I'm doing the right thing for you," though I thought it. I didn't say, "I'm doing this because you made a mistake." Instead, I told her I loved her and that she needed to be prepared for questions. She laughed at the thought, and then the laugh broke into a cough, and she said, "You always do things quietly." I told her that sometimes quiet had to be precise. The day arrived like any other wedding day. Bouquets, last-minute tux adjustments, a flurry of servers. I moved through the crowd the way an owner should, present, unobtrusive, smiling when appropriate. Wesley had his headset in and looked like a general in the wings. Naomi was not present. Forensic accountants do not usually light confetti. Rebecca sat at a corner table with a neat stack of papers and a phone face down. I could see the outline of Agent Reeves' presence in Rebecca's posture, reassured perhaps by the knowledge that law enforcement would interpret numbers more strictly than social tidings. It's a strange thing to stand in a room where your power is both literal and almost invisible. I could have whispered to the host and asked them to move a microphone a few inches. I could have asked that the band save a song. I could have required that the Whitmores be seated at the far end of the room. Instead, I let the evening breathe. My restraint had purpose. So when Franklin rose to give a toast, a man with a smile that had been practiced since childhood and the kind of voice that sounds better on recording than in person, I watched him for a moment and thought about how people can tell lies in the rhythm of a speech. He thanked people, as toasts require, and then he offered the phrase that had set things in motion weeks earlier, a small joke about bringing money into the family that was meant to be flattering but landed like a declaration. It was the line we had been waiting for, not because we wanted to shame Garrett in public, but because the line anchored the Whitmore's motive in the ears of the crowd. If any honest doubt remained, Franklin had just cast it into the open. Wesley, at my nod, moved toward the AV console with the quiet confidence of a man who has pulled cables under tables for 10 years. Rebecca's hand hovered over her phone, ready to call Agent Reeves should the readings meet the threshold. Naomi texted me 2 words: "Ready, confirm." I felt the room tilt toward potential chaos and then steadied it with a breath. This was a hinge moment, not a victory yet, not an arrest, not forgiveness, just facts about to meet light. I thought briefly about my grandmother's necklace against Sloane's throat, the way it had caught the chandelier light earlier in the evening. That image pushed me forward with a clarity that surprised me. I wasn't doing this to humiliate. I was doing this to return what was ours, to correct a ledger that had been allowed to run wild. Wesley's fingers danced on the console. The music dimmed as if cued by invisible hands. I could see the bandleader blink in confusion. The screens that had previously shown a slideshow of the couple's engagement photos flickered. On my lapel, my phone buzzed. "Rebecca, Agent Reeves is on her way. She'll be there within minutes. Be ready." I felt the room inhale with me, and then everything waited. The band's chords stretched thin and then cut clean. For a heartbeat, the room was nothing but the sound of people breathing and the click of heels on marble. Then the screens that held engagement photos dissolved into a series of documents, clear, unambiguous, and ugly in their precision. First came a bank statement, magnified until every column was legible. Dates, amounts, the names of shell entities that Naomi had traced with a patience that made the numbers feel personal. Then came a page with the heading from the Arizona filing, a photograph that matched the woman who had been introduced to our family as Sloane. Only the file name revealed the truth, Sandra Williams. Underneath, a small excerpt from a public court docket.
Next, an invoice with a Whitmore Properties LLC letterhead, its routing instructions highlighted in red like a surgeon's incision. The camera lingered on a wire transfer split into thirds, one portion paying for a rehearsal dinner at a downtown venue, another portion going to a trust in a neighboring state, the third routed to an account with a name that meant nothing to the Whitmore's polished public profile. A ripple went through the room. People shifted in their chairs, conversations thinned to a hum. I could feel the collective attention of 100 strangers pivot toward the truth, the way iron turns toward a magnet. Franklin's face, for the first time that evening, was not composed. He laughed, short and brittle, then asked in a voice that tried to be casual, "Is this a joke?" It wasn't.
The next slide was Naomi's work, a chart that connected aliases to accounts to events in our city. It read like a map of small theft, an atlas of misdirection. The text was clinical, but the implication was simple. The Whitmore's lifestyle had been funded, in part, by the kind of schemes that eat the trust out of families. Wesley's hand was on the console, steady as ever. He had a radio tucked into his vest, and his eyes were on me, asking a question without words. "Is now?" I gave the smallest nod. Rebecca's phone was in her palm, but she wasn't calling. She was waiting the same way a surgeon waits for a heartbeat to stabilize before making the incision that will correct the rhythm. That's the particular cruelty of evidence. It does not shout. It simply sits on a screen and waits for people to read it. When they did, the laughter died in corners, and the soft clinks of cutlery fell off the table. People leaned forward. Someone gasped. Patricia's fingers found her glass again, this time searching for something steadier than champagne. Franklin stood, pale, and addressed the room with a bravado that didn't reach his voice. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Someone is playing with our names." The next slide showed his name, Franklin Whitmore, next to those shell companies Naomi had uncovered, with the routing numbers underlined. The crowd read it first and then looked at Franklin, as if expecting him to reach across the table and touch the documents away. Agent Carla Reeves did not burst through the door with sirens. She walked in with the deliberate gait of someone who had seen the world of numbers and names before and was uninterested in theatrics. She showed her badge quickly, no flourish, and spoke to Rebecca in a low voice I could not make out, though Rebecca's face very clearly relaxed, the way a person relaxes when a plan takes shape within the law. Against my better theatrical instincts, I did not step forward and point. I stayed where an owner must stand, visible but not performative. Let the documents do the speaking. Let the law make the arrest. That was the core of everything I'd asked for. No bullying, no extrajudicial exposure, just the measured application of evidence and authority. Agent Reeves moved through the room with a pair of officers at her back. She addressed the Whitmores by name, and when Franklin tried to interrupt, she held up a hand. "Sir, we have probable cause for inquiries into financial misconduct and fraud," she said, voice exact and steady. "We'll need to speak to you and your guests. I'd appreciate your cooperation." Sloane, Sandra, had been seated, the necklace sitting low at her throat like a punctuation point. The first screen slide that showed her name and the Arizona docket was followed by a close-up of the necklace's chain, attached in a photo with a timestamp that aligned with the file Naomi had found, referencing a sale to an address that matched a post office box tied to a Whitmore account. It was tiny and bureaucratic and utterly undeniable. She tried the look of surprise, then the look of offense, and then the look of wounded innocence, all in one breath. "This is a mistake," she said. Her voice was high, trembling now, the practiced cadence of someone who had performed shocked before. "You must have the wrong person. My family." "Miss Williams," Agent Reeves said, using the name Naomi's research had unearthed, "we're going to ask you to come with us." There was a moment when Sloane's eyes went to Garrett. She reached, then faltered, searching for the ballast he'd seemed to be. Garrett was no longer laughing. He had been listening. He had been absorbing the same images that everyone else was. His face had drained of color, and the weight of recognition was a physical thing. He looked at me, really looked, and something like a break opened in him. "Garrett," I said quietly later, when we had a minute between the first police questions and the press clustering outside the hotel. "It's okay. You can listen." He breathed in and out like someone learning to swim. "Did you know?" he asked, voice thin. "I knew enough," I said. I didn't explain the nuance, the anonymous payments, the protective reasons, the hard private labor of paying bills so that my mother could keep believing in the life she had. But he had seen the screen that matched Sandra Williams to an earlier fraud. He had seen the wire transfers that connected Whitmore Properties LLC to accounts that paid for things in our town. Those slides were a language. He began to translate. "What does this mean?" he asked. "That they were building a story about us," I said, and kept my other hand from reaching for his.
That story had a price. We called the bill. He looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. I thought I was doing the right thing. His apology arrived as a small, raw sound that belonged to the man I'd known since we swapped comic books on the porch. I'm so sorry, Beth. I never... You loved her, I said. It wasn't an excuse and it wasn't judgment. It was a factual statement. Love makes us poor translators of people's performance. But she wasn't who she said she was. Garrett's eyes drifted to Sloane, who was crying now, big theatrical sobs that looked designed to arrest attention. A few guests, old acquaintances of the Whitmores, stood like tabloid prop bones. Others looked vomitously pleased, their satisfaction thin and unsightly. Agent Reeves read the necessary rites aloud. The Whitmores were patted down, officers were discreet but efficient. Sloane Sandra's protests softened into a whine. Franklin's demands for Bemuth were countered by the documents already on the screens and by Rebecca's calm, exact submissions. Rebecca had made sure Agent Reeves had what she needed to act now without creating an illegal spectacle. I watched all of this and felt my body do a strange thing. It relaxed into the shape it had occupied for years. Work mode.
The crisis was not a show. It was a set of operations: evidence, legal procedure, chain of custody, interviews. Naomi would need to certify the prints. Rebecca would need to file. I was not at liberty to gloat. The law would do what it does in its own rhythm. But there was a scene I'd rehearsed in my head that no amount of practical sobriety had prepared me for. Sloane's fingers at the necklace, fumbling as if for a prop, then as if for a talisman, and then finally letting it go. She spat out something. Hadn't we all been charmed? And one of the officers, who had probably seen too many theatrical self-exculpations, picked up the chain, turned it over in his gloved hand, and looked at me. No theatrics. Is this yours? He asked. It was, of course, my grandmother's necklace. I had imagined dramatic returns, me stepping forward, taking it, holding it high so everyone could know they were wrong. Instead, I walked across a room heavy with paperwork and people, and took it back quietly. When I lifted it, it felt exactly as it had in the dark of my apartment after late-night calls and unpaid invoices, a small weight against my throat that pivoted my sense of who I was. My mother saw me holding it, and she did something that surprised me. She wrapped her hand around mine and said, "I'm sorry." Her voice was small and practical, like a woman starting to rearrange a life with a little more honesty in it. I didn't shout that I had been the one sending the money for 4 years. That admission was not theatrics either. It was a conversation for later, one I wanted to have away from badges and cameras. For now, I let my mother hold the necklace again. She cried, real salt tears that did not sound performative, and then she laughed in an odd, breaking way that carried relief and humiliation in the same breath. After the arrests, people drifted toward the exits in clusters, gossip already forming into versions of the night that would be told at kitchen tables and on morning shows. Reporters had started to gather by the valet lanes. I made myself speak to as many of our staff as I could. Wesley found me in the kitchen, among the boxes of desalted lemons and spare linens, and simply put a hand on my shoulder. He said, the way he always did, "You did the right thing." I thought of all the small nights, the late cleans, the invoices paid on time, the calls to contractors, and how they had built a house of competence sturdy enough to hold the truth. The staff had known more about me than anyone else in the room. They had seen me move from mop to ledger as if it were the natural order of things, and their loyalty was not a theatrical loyalty. It was earned. By midnight, the Whitmores were in the back of a federal car, their faces hollow and glitching between anger and something like shame. Sloane had called Garrett's name as they were led away, voice cracking. "Garrett, tell them!" But the man standing where I once stood as a child, trading secrets and comic books, had begun steps toward a different figure of himself. In private, later, he would tell me he had felt foolish and unreachable in equal parts. He would ask how long I had been paying the bills. I would tell him the truth when the storm cleared, because he needed it and because the family needed to stop living on illusions. The press spun the night into headlines with admirable efficiency. "Local millionaire's family embarrassed by fraud," ran one morning's column. Another read, "Engagement party ends in federal arrests." I read the variations and felt the odd detachment of someone watching a biographer misread a sentence. They were all true in pieces, and all false in the ways that matter. No story could capture the precise economy of my small labors. The nights of learning accounting, the months of building trust with lenders, the afternoons calling in favors to get a repair done on cred, because those things didn't read well on a headline. They read better in the quiet of a ledger and the steady march of receipts. Agent Reeves called me later that night to say the Whitmores had been processed and that they had looked surprised when Naomi's materials were presented in the affidavit. "You and your team did us a service by being precise," she said.
"We can take it from here." That was the closest thing to gratitude I got from law enforcement. Agent Reeves is the kind of person whose satisfaction is professional and not sentimental. It was enough. In the days that followed, our hotel became a minor circus. Interview requests came from morning shows and local papers. I declined most. Rebecca advised me on media strategy with the same calm precision she used in court filings. We drafted a short statement. Birch Hospitality does not condone fraud. We support law enforcement and the process. Our priority is the safety and dignity of our staff and our guests. It was true, careful, and a relief. When the family gathered that first weekend, the house felt like a place that had been rearranged by someone who'd come to care for it. Patricia's apology was repeated 3 times and then revised as she tried to translate being wrong into something that felt practical. I didn't mean to give away what wasn't mine to give. She sought forgiveness by making room for the truth rather than excusing herself. It was clumsy. It was human. Garrett and I talked for hours over the following week. Late mornings with coffee, walks down to the river where we had once raced bikes. He read every document Naomi had allowed us to see and asked the kinds of questions that indicated someone was trying to understand rather than simply to be innocent of blame.
Apologies moved between us in small, concrete ways. He handled a vendor dispute for the hotel. He sat through a meeting with Rebecca where she explained bank holds and the way subpoenas worked. We did practical things together that rebuilt a very particular kind of trust. The trust that says you can rely on a person to do the small things right when the world gets absurd. There were consequences, public and private. The Whitmores faced federal charges filed by the prosecutor's office. Their arraignment was scheduled. I was careful in what I said publicly. Rebecca had cautioned me against commentary that could complicate investigations, and she was right. The law had moved. We had supplied the facts. Justice would follow its own course. I did not celebrate in the newspapers. I was instead grateful that our staff and our guests felt safer, knowing that the people who had been targeting families were no longer free to practice the same pattern here. There was a smaller, quieter victory that I want to linger on because it matters in a way that legal paperwork does not: the return of the necklace to the place it belonged. I sat with my mother in the afternoon sun, the 2 of us on the Monarch's small rooftop patio where the air smells of lemon and old wood. She turned the chain in her hands like a woman studying a found heirloom. "You were right," she said, and the sentence was not mockery or sting, but an ignition that felt like letting a window open on a warm day. "You gave it away because you wanted to be liked," I said. It was a soft truth. "I was tired of being invisible," she admitted. "It felt good to be part of something glamorous. But I didn't know," her voice cracked. "I never suspected." We did not make a spectacle of the confession. We simply sat and drank tea and talked about what would change. She agreed to therapy. Rebecca had recommended someone who specializes in family dynamics and shame, and she began to pay attention to the things that had been easy to ignore when someone else quietly paid the bills. I told her at last that I had been the one making the payments, anonymous transfers that had kept our lights on and our lives moving when money was tight. There was no dramatic thunderclap when I said it. She cried again, but in a way that felt like release. Not for shame, but for truth. "You kept us going," she said. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because I wanted you to have stability without embarrassment," I said. "I wanted you to feel like you had choices." That is not the simplest answer, but it was true. Also true was the cost. Anonymity had let a narrative grow that made me both invisible and vulnerable to scorn. One morning, 3 weeks after the party, I woke to a different rhythm. There were cameras at the courthouse and private investigators asking for interviews. There were also emails from lenders confirming that our accounts were secure, and from vendors asking if they could continue to work with us. Naomi sent me an update that read, in its forensic earnestness, "We've established probable cause on several accounts that show coordinated misdirection. Recommendations attached. Rebecca scheduled a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office to ensure their filings were clean and airtight." Garrett came to that meeting with me. He'd learned a lot in the 3 weeks after being confronted with the idea that someone he wanted to believe in could be a liar. There is a particular humility that arrives when you realize a person you trusted had an agenda that involved you as a prize. He was not defensive, he was present. He asked questions about bank holds and witness statements, and about the timeline Naomi had prepared. I liked that he wanted to understand. We started to rebuild our family's public story in small, careful ways. We hosted a low-key dinner for close relatives, where Patricia read a short letter she had written about being careful with being dazzled by appearances, and about the importance of asking for proof. It was not theatrical contrition. It was a practical attempt to teach a lesson without shame. Out of all of this, I made a conscious choice to use what I had, Birch Hospitality, the Monarch, my position, to create room for others who, like me, had the ambition but not the access. That was when the scholarship arose. Nicole Patterson is, on paper, unremarkable in the way the most interesting people are. She grew up in a small town 20 miles outside ours, worked 3 part-time jobs while attending community college, and applied for an internship at the Monarch with trembling hopefulness. When she arrived for orientation, she told me she had been the first in her family to go to college. She borrowed a suit from her aunt for the interview and wore it like armor. By the time Naomi's report had been filed and the Whitmores had been taken into custody, Nicole had become a part of the hotel's day flow. She knew the linens and the morning breakfast routine, she could manage reservations, and she took to spreadsheets the way some people take to music. I thought of her often when I sat through Naomi's dense columns of numbers, and when I signed a check for legal fees that would have been easier not to spend. Money had been a story in our family that could be used for good or else twisted. I decided to channel some of the resources we had into a single concrete program, the Monarch Hospitality Scholarship, to fund education and offer internships and mentoring to young people who wanted a career in hospitality but lacked access to capital or connections. Nicole was the first recipient. We announced the scholarship at a small luncheon, nothing flashy, just staff, a few board members, and Rebecca sitting in the corner with a polite smile. Garrett stayed with me that day. He introduced Nicole at the podium, and he did it like a man who had learned the value of small truth. "She's earned this," he said simply.
Not because of where she comes from, but because of the work she's done. Nicole cried when I told her the scholarship would pay for her remaining tuition and that she'd have a paid internship at Birch Hospitality with mentorship from our leadership team. "I thought this was a dream," she said, searching for composure. I told her it was real, and then we talked, quietly, about goals and about the way hospitality is not merely fluff, but ethics acted out, making people safe, paying vendors on time, treating staff like adults. She nodded as if someone had finally given her a vocabulary for what she felt. I do not tell that story to make myself look generous. I tell it because the whole arc of the Whitmore episode taught me something practical. Power without responsibility is dangerous. Responsibility without power is impotent. A person who has both can use it to clean more than rooms. They can help pick up the pieces after people have been conned and start making structures that prevent the same deception in the future. The media attention subsided into the steady hum of local life. The legal process moved at its own glacial pace. Hearings scheduled, motions filed, a preliminary hearing where the prosecutor laid out the pattern Naomi had uncovered. I was careful not to comment beyond the statement Rebecca and I had drafted. There was no triumph in press releases. There was only a steady, necessary process. Documents, testimony, examination. The Whitmores were in custody, and the U.S. attorney had sufficient evidence to proceed with charges. Beyond that, I would not speculate. I took a day off at some point in the month following everything, which is not something I had allowed myself in a long time. I walked the corridors of the Monarch with a cup of coffee and allowed myself the small luxury of noticing the work I had done. An urn of lilies were placed with potted succulents, the sunlight in the Brexit nook, the housekeeper's gentle way of folding linens. These details are the true currency of a business like mine. Money is one thing, craft and consistency are another. There were people who were proud for me and people who were not, the latter often choosing to reduce the complexity of what had happened to a simple morality play. That is the risk of public life. Nuance is easily flattened. I took refuge in the small details again. My ledger, Naomi's emails, Rebecca's notes. Those things did not flatter. They told the truth. Garrett and I continued to navigate our relationship like two adults learning a new language. We still had frictions. His tendency to enjoy social praise, my tendency to measure people by contracts and deadlines. We found in slow increments a rhythm of communicating where apologies were not theatrical but practical. He agreed to attend a few vendor meetings to learn the practicalities of cash flow. I let him handle community outreach for one charity dinner. It wasn't romance, it was repair.
There is an ethical line I tried very hard not to cross in the days after. The temptation to turn exposure into spectacle. Some people wanted more, public shaming, more dramatic reenactments, a television special. I resisted. I had been careful about the law because I wanted the truth to be the final arbiter, not our capacity for drama. Justice is not always satisfying as entertainment. It is sober, bureaucratic, necessary. In private, I still went back over the moments that had stung. Sloane's whisper at the table, Patricia's naive generosity, the small way the family's assumptions gave others purchase to manipulate us. I thought about how often women, particularly those who choose to keep their success tidy and quiet, are underestimated. There's a certain economy to being underestimated. There's also a certain loneliness. I had chosen anonymity for reasons I believed noble, to let my mother feel steady, to make sure the bills were paid and the house kept. In doing so, I'd allowed a narrative to form that made me invisible. That invisibility had been weaponized against us. That was the lesson.
it was also an education in how power must be wielded, calmly, legally, and with room for repair. I could have exacted revenge. I chose not to. Instead, I chose documentation and patient procedure. That felt like dignity. A month after the arrests, I was asked to speak at a small conference on hospitality ethics. I agreed and used the time to make a point that had pressed on me since the first spreadsheet arrived in my inbox. The business of hospitality is not hospitality without accountability, I told the audience. We have an obligation to protect the trust placed in us, our guests' trust, our vendors' trust, and the trust of our families. I spoke not as a victory lap, but as a cautionary tale. People came up to me afterward and thanked me for being moderate. That made me feel like I'd done something right. There were small practical outcomes that followed. Rebecca's work helped the federal team maintain a clean chain of custody for the evidence Naomi had found. Naomi was publicly praised in a footnote in a legal brief, which is hardly glamorous but means more to a forensic accountant than a headline. Wesley got a commendation from our board for how he had handled operations during a volatile night. These were tiny rewardings of competence, and they mattered more to me than any public accolade. Patricia began to attend therapy regularly. She surprised me by volunteering at a local community center teaching a knitting class. It felt like a modest reclaiming of small pleasures that no one could sell or manipulate. She also asked for my help in learning to manage her own finances and stop relying on an anonymous safety net. We set up a monthly meeting where she looked over the accounts with me and asked questions, a small act of trust that felt like a new beginning. As for Garrett, he stayed at the Monarch more.
He took responsibility for being present at community events and learning the tedious ethics of running a business. That might sound small to hear, but to me it was the visible turning of a life toward responsibility instead of performance. It felt like redemption of a sort one could actually see. Not a hero story, but steady work. Months later, there were still legal hearings. The prosecutors filed charges. The Whitmores hired counsel, as is their right. The process would continue. My involvement with the case had been procedural and evidentiary. Beyond providing what Naomi and Rebecca needed, I had no desire to litigate in public. I had a business to run and a family to repair. The Monarch returned to being a place people celebrated at rather than a site of spectacle. We updated our training programs to include red flags, how to spot when vendors or patrons might be part of wider schemes, how staff could flag odd invoices, and how to keep personal generosity from being exploited. Money, I had learned, can be both a shield and a vulnerability. Education is a modest but durable defense. At the scholarship luncheon, Nicole came to the podium and told a story about her grandmother giving her one small piece of advice: never let anyone make you invisible. She looked at me and said, "Ms. Burns, you made me visible." I felt both embarrassed and proud in that precise, complicated way that comes when someone's gratitude lands where you didn't know you wanted it. In private, I still sometimes felt the sting, the whisper, the glance. They remain, in my memory, as notes that keep a melody honest. But those moments became less about humiliation and more about a reality lesson. People will assume narrations that fit their comfort. Some will be kind and others predatory. The remedy is careful, persistent work, ledger entries, counsel, an eye for detail, and the patience to let evidence accumulate until it becomes undeniable. I never wanted the story to be about me proving their error as entertainment. The real triumph, if you want to call it that, was restoring dignity to my mother, protecting our staff, and creating a program that lets someone like Nicole have options. I signed the deed on this building years before the party happened, but ownership is more than a clause. It is the obligation to make the room function, to ensure people in it are safe, and to act when the trust that underpins social life is threatened. Sometimes people ask me if I felt vindictive when the screens went dark and the Whitmores were led away. The answer is complicated. Vindication is a small human thing, natural enough. But what I felt more strongly was a deep fatigue that comes with bearing a secret and then knowing it has become dangerous. I felt relief more than anything. Relief that the person who had stolen trust could no longer ply that trade here. Relief that my mother could learn. Relief that we could begin to correct what had been broken.
When I stand now at the Monarch's reception desk, watching couples come in with plans and vendors with sample cakes, I think of the whisper again. People will always say things in rooms, offhand slurs, jokes meant to land like silk, comments that mark who belongs and who doesn't. There are two responses to those slights: roar or rearrange the furniture. I chose to rearrange the furniture because it felt more permanent. It felt better to build a house that refused to welcome predators than to shout at them when they finally tripped. If there is one part of the story I want to leave you with, it is this: power that is quiet but principled is more effective than the loud justice people imagine in films. It is boring and tedious and undeniably slow. It is also the kind of thing that protects people who do not have the time or resources to protect themselves. That is the work I wanted to do when I signed the deed 3 years earlier, and it is the work I double down on now. If you liked this story and want to hear more about what it takes to run a business that protects people rather than preens, like and subscribe for more.